Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing into Iran, a land where ancient empires once ruled the known world and where poetry is considered as essential as water. This is a country that invented the windmill, the postal system, and possibly the world's first known sommelier culture, though they'd probably argue about the wine part these days. From the snow-capped peaks of Mount Damavand to the furnace-like deserts of Dashti Lut, literally called the Desert of Emptiness, which sounds like something you'd name after a particularly bad Monday. Iran's geography reads like nature's own epic novel. We're talking about a civilization that was already hosting elaborate garden parties, while most of Europe was still figuring out basic agriculture. Tonight, we'll explore how this crossroads of civilizations shaped everything from chess to ice cream, and why Persian poets managed to make desert survival sound romantic. Fair warning, by the end of this journey, you might find yourself inexplicably craving rosewater and questioning why your own culture doesn't have better metaphors for heartbreak. If you're the type who enjoys falling asleep to stories of ancient empires, ingenious water management, and the occasional Mongol invasion, hit that subscribe button, because we've got 195 more countries to explore, and trust me, some of them have even more complicated histories than figuring out who actually invented the bagel. Now, let's settle in and discover why Iran has been civilization's favourite recurring character for over 2.5 millennia. Chapter 1. Ancient Persia, from Cyrus to Alexander. The Iranian plateau stretches like a vast high tableland roughly the size of Alaska, though considerably more hospitable to human habitation, unless you're particularly fond of arguing with polar bears about property rights. This plateau, sitting at about 4,000 feet above sea level, is cradled by some of the world's most impressive mountain ranges. To the north, the Alborz Mountains stretch like a protective arm, while the Zagros Mountains sweep down the western edge like nature's own Great Wall, though considerably more prone to earthquakes and significantly less visited by tourists with selfie sticks. The geography here isn't just scenic backdrop, it's the director of this entire historical drama. The Iranian plateau sits at the crossroads of 3 continents, making it the world's most inconveniently located real estate for anyone hoping for a quiet retirement. Mesopotamia beckons from the west. The steppes of Central Asia stretch endlessly to the north and east, and the riches of India lie tantalizingly to the southeast. It's rather like living in the middle of the world's busiest intersection, except the traffic consists of armies, merchants, and the occasional confused nomad who took a wrong turn somewhere near the Caspian Sea. Long before anyone had heard of Persia, this land was home to some remarkably sophisticated civilizations. The Elamites, for instance, were busy building cities and writing in cuneiform, while most of Europe was still figuring out the finer points of not getting eaten by large mammals. Their capital at Susa would later become one of the jewels of the Persian Empire, though the Elamites themselves would have been rather surprised to learn this, being thoroughly conquered by that point. Around the 10th century before the Common Era, into this already bustling neighbourhood came 2 groups of people who would change everything, the Medes and the Persians. Both were Iranian peoples, and yes, Iran literally means land of the Aryans, though this has absolutely nothing to do with 20th century European nonsense and everything to do with the fact that these were Indo-European speaking peoples who called themselves Arya, meaning noble ones. They were probably noble, though like most ancient peoples, they had a somewhat flexible definition of nobility that often involved whose turn it was to raid whose cattle. The Medes got their act together first, establishing a kingdom in the northwest of the plateau around the 7th century before the Common Era. They were apparently quite good at the whole civilization business, developing a reputation for wisdom, horsemanship, and wearing very impressive hats. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that the Medes were chosen to rule over other Iranian tribes because they were the most just. This is roughly equivalent to being voted most likely to share their lunch money in ancient Persian high school, but it seems to have worked out reasonably well for everyone involved. Meanwhile, down in the southern regions of Fars, which would later give its name to Persia, the Persian tribes were quietly going about their business of herding, farming, and presumably perfecting the art of making really excellent carpets. They were, by most accounts, a relatively minor player in the grand theatre of Middle Eastern politics. This was about to change rather dramatically, thanks to a young prince named Cyrus. Cyrus II, who had earned the rather impressive sobriquet the Great, though at birth he was probably just called the Loud or possibly the one who keeps everyone up at night, was born around 590 before the Common Era. His grandfather was Astyages, king of the Medes, which should have made for pleasant family gatherings, except that Astyages had received a prophecy that his grandson would overthrow him. This sort of prophecy is remarkably common in ancient history, and has the curious effect of being self-fulfilling, rather like predicting that touching a hot stove will burn you and then immediately grabbing the nearest hot stove to test the theory. Astyages decided to have baby Cyrus killed, handing this delicate task over to a nobleman named Harpagus. However, Harpagus seems to have had some qualms about murdering babies, which speaks well of his character if not his career prospects. Instead, he handed the child over to a shepherd to raise in the mountains. This is one of the oldest stories in the book, Moses in the rushes, Romulus and Remus with their wolf. There's something deeply satisfying to the human psyche about a future hero being raised in humble circumstances. By 550 before the Common Era, Cyrus had become king of the Persians and was apparently rather tired of being vassals to the Medes. The resulting conflict reads like a classical tragedy, complete with prophecy, betrayal, and awkward family dinners. Cyrus defeated his grandfather Astyages and, in a move that would become characteristic of his reign, treated the conquered Median nobility with remarkable clemency. This was revolutionary behaviour for the time. The standard operating procedure when conquering your neighbours was to kill the leadership, enslave the population, burn the cities, and salt the earth. Cyrus, however, seems to have invented the radical concept of winning hearts and minds. He kept Median administrators in their positions, respected local customs, and generally behaved as though conquering people didn't necessarily mean making their lives miserable. With the Medes incorporated into what was becoming the Persian Empire, Cyrus turned his attention to the wider world. To the west lay Lydia, ruled by King Croesus, whose name has become synonymous with wealth. The story of Cyrus versus Croesus has everything a good historical narrative needs: hubris, divine intervention, and a twist ending. Croesus, confident in his interpretation of oracular prophecy, decided to test Persian resolve. The oracle had told him that if he attacked Cyrus, he would destroy a great empire. This seemed like excellent news until he discovered that the empire in question was his own, a classic case of divine beings being technically correct in the most unhelpful way possible. The conquest of Lydia in 546 before the Common Era brought Cyrus control of the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor. This put him into direct contact with the Greek world, beginning a relationship that would shape both Persian and Greek history for centuries to come. It was rather like two neighbours meeting for the first time and immediately beginning an argument that would last for 300 years and ultimately reshape the entire known world. But Cyrus wasn't finished expanding. To the east lay the vast steppes and kingdoms of Central Asia, populated by people who had made nomadic warfare into an art form. Cyrus spent years campaigning in these regions, extending Persian control deep into what is now Afghanistan. It was during one of these eastern campaigns that Cyrus met his end, around 530 before the Common Era. Herodotus blames Queen Tamiris of the Massagetae, who apparently took exception to Cyrus's expansion plans and demonstrated her displeasure in the traditional nomadic fashion. Yet Cyrus's legacy was far greater than his conquests. In Babylon, which he had captured by the simple expedient of diverting the river that ran through it, he issued what has been called the world's first charter of human rights. The Cyrus Cylinder proclaimed religious tolerance, the repatriation of displaced peoples, and the restoration of temples. Most famously, Cyrus liberated the Jewish exiles from Babylonian captivity, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The Hebrew Bible calls him Meshiach, the Anointed One. Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, inherited not only a vast empire but also his father's expansionist ambitions, though unfortunately not his political wisdom. Cambyses decided that what the Persian Empire really needed was Egypt, and in 525 before the Common Era, he obligingly conquered it, making Persia the first power in history to unite Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Nile Valley under a single crown. However, Cambyses seems to have missed the memo about his father's enlightened administrative policies. In Egypt, he apparently managed to offend just about everyone by failing to respect local religious customs, including the worship of cats, bulls, and various other animals that Persians found perfectly reasonable to eat, but Egyptians considered sacred. Cambyses died under mysterious circumstances while returning from Egypt to deal with a usurper. What followed was a brief but intense succession crisis that nearly tore the young empire apart. Into this chaos stepped Darius, a young nobleman from a collateral branch of the royal family who possessed the two most important qualifications for ancient rulership: a talent for violence and an even greater talent for organization. Darius I spent his first few years putting down rebellions across the empire with the systematic efficiency of a very determined accountant. The famous Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in western Iran, records his victories in 3 languages and includes what might be the world's first propaganda photographs, if you consider bas-relief carvings to be an early form of photography. But Darius's real genius lay not in conquering but in organizing. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who was responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and not getting too ambitious for his own good. This system was so effective that it would survive for over 2 centuries, which in the ancient world was roughly equivalent to a modern government program actually working as intended. The Persian Empire under Darius stretched from the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Black Sea in the north, from the cataracts of the Nile in the south to the Aegean Sea in the west. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, encompassing perhaps 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages and worshipping hundreds of gods. Managing this diverse population required a level of administrative sophistication that would not be seen again until the Romans. The Persian system of government was remarkably tolerant for its time. Local customs were respected, existing religious practices were maintained, and administrative structures were often left intact as long as taxes were paid and rebellions were avoided. The famous Persian postal system connected the farthest reaches of the empire with relay stations and fresh horses. The Persians built roads, bridges, and canal systems that connected regions that had never been in contact before. They standardized weights and measures, established a common currency, and created what was essentially the world's first international trade network. Yet this remarkable empire contained the seeds of its own greatest challenge: the Greek city-states to the west. The Ionian Revolt of 499 before the Common Era began as a relatively minor rebellion by Greek cities in Asia Minor, who decided they were tired of Persian rule and Persian taxes. The revolt might have remained a local affair if the Greeks hadn't asked for help from their cousins across the Aegean. Athens and Eretria decided to support the rebels by burning Sardis, the Persian administrative capital in Asia Minor. This was roughly equivalent to spray painting graffiti on the Pentagon and then being surprised when the government takes it personally. Darius, who had been dealing with rebellions for his entire reign, decided that the Greek problem needed a permanent solution. The result was the Persian Wars, a series of conflicts that would define the relationship between East and West for generations. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, these battles would become the stuff of legend. The Persian invasion of Greece under Darius, and later under his son Xerxes, represented the high water mark of Persian expansion. The empire that had begun with a Persian prince in the mountains of Fars had grown to encompass most of the known world. Yet the stubborn resistance of the Greek city-states proved that even the mightiest empire had limits, and that sometimes a few hundred determined warriors standing in the right mountain pass could change the course of history. By the time Xerxes retreated from Greece in 479 before the Common Era, the Persian Empire had reached its zenith. It stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, from the Caucasus Mountains to the deserts of Egypt. The Persians had created something unprecedented, a truly multicultural empire that governed through tolerance rather than oppression, administration rather than brutality. Yet this great achievement contained within it the seeds of future challenges. The very tolerance that made the empire so successful also meant that local identities remained strong, that satrapies could develop their own ambitions, and that unity depended heavily on the personal authority of the great king. The Persian system worked brilliantly when guided by rulers like Cyrus and Darius, but it would prove vulnerable to both internal decay and external pressure from a new power rising in the West. The stage was set for one of history's greatest collisions between civilizations, as the Persian Empire that had conquered most of the known world would soon face a young Macedonian king whose ambitions knew no bounds. The meeting between Persian administrative genius and Greek military innovation would reshape the ancient world in ways that neither side could have imagined. Chapter 2: Parthians, Sassanids, and Islamic Conquest. The death of Alexander the Great in 323, before the Common Era left his vast empire about as unified as a jigsaw puzzle after a toddler gets hold of it. His generals, known as the Diadochi, spent the next few decades enthusiastically carving up the known world among themselves, proving that even in ancient times, inheritance disputes could get spectacularly out of hand. The Iranian plateau fell to Seleucus I, who founded the Seleucid Empire and presumably thought he had secured a nice, quiet retirement property in the east. The Seleucids ruled Iran as part of their Hellenistic Empire, bringing Greek culture and administrators to a land that had been Persian for over 2 centuries. It was rather like redecorating your grandmother's house in ultra-modern style, technically an improvement, but somehow missing the point entirely. The Seleucids established cities, built gymnasiums and theatres, and generally tried to convince everyone that being Greek was the height of sophistication. This cultural experiment might have worked if the Seleucids had been able to maintain control over their vast territories. Unfortunately, governing an empire that stretched from Turkey to Afghanistan proved about as manageable as herding cats. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Seleucid grip on the eastern provinces was weakening, creating the perfect opportunity for ambitious local rulers to assert their independence. Enter the Parthians, a group that would give the Romans nightmares for the next 4 centuries. Originally known as the Parni, they were a nomadic Iranian tribe from the steppes beyond the Oxus River. part of a larger confederation called the Dahe. These were people who had perfected the art of mounted warfare to such a degree that their very name would become synonymous with a particular type of military tactic, the famous Parthian shot, where mounted archers would pretend to retreat while firing arrows backwards at their pursuers. It was the ancient equivalent of giving someone the slip while simultaneously throwing rocks at them. Around 247 before the Common Era, when the Seleucid king Seleucus II was busy fighting a civil war in the west, a Seleucid satrap named Andragoras decided this would be an excellent time to declare independence in the province of Parthia. This was roughly equivalent to declaring yourself king while your boss is dealing with a hostile takeover, technically possible, but likely to end poorly. Indeed, before Andragoras could properly establish himself as an independent ruler, the Parni swept down from the north and conquered the region, making themselves masters of northeastern Iran. The first Parthian king was Arsaces I, whose name would give the new dynasty its official title, the Arsacids. For the first century or so, the Parthians were content to be relatively minor players in the grand game of Middle Eastern politics, paying tribute to the Seleucids when pressed and generally trying to avoid attracting too much attention from either Rome or the various Central Asian nomads, who periodically decided that settled civilization needed a good thrashing. Everything changed under Mithridates I, who ruled from about 171 to 132 before the Common Era. Mithridates began systematically expanding Parthian control over the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, capturing Media and eventually seizing Mesopotamia from the increasingly feeble Seleucids. By the time of his death, the Parthian Empire stretched from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush, a remarkable achievement for a dynasty that had started out as nomadic raiders. The Parthians proved to be surprisingly effective empire builders, though they took a different approach than their Achaemenid predecessors. Instead of centralized rule, the Parthians governed through a feudal arrangement of vassal kings and local nobles. The Arsacid king held the title of King of Kings, but his actual power depended heavily on the loyalty of various subordinate rulers. It was rather like being the CEO of a company where all the department heads own their own subsidiaries and have been known to stage hostile takeovers. This decentralized system had both advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, it allowed the Parthians to govern an enormously diverse empire without the massive administrative apparatus that centralized rule would have required. Local customs could be maintained, local languages could be spoken, and local religions could be practiced without interference from Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. On the negative side, it meant that the empire was only as strong as the personal loyalty of its component parts, and personal loyalty has an unfortunate tendency to evaporate when more attractive offers come along. The Parthians' greatest challenge came from the west, where the expanding Roman Republic was beginning to take an unhealthy interest in Eastern affairs. The first major collision occurred in 53 before the Common Era, when Marcus Licinius Crassus, one-third of Rome's first triumvirate along with Pompey and Caesar, decided that conquering Parthia would be an excellent way to enhance his military reputation and fill his already considerable coffers. Crassus probably should have done more research before embarking on his eastern adventure. The Battle of Carrhae became one of Rome's most spectacular military disasters, as Parthian mounted archers under the general Sharina systematically destroyed a Roman army that outnumbered them by more than 3-1. The Romans, weighed down by heavy armour and accustomed to close-quarters fighting, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to stand still and fight like gentlemen. Crassus himself was killed, and according to legend, molten gold was poured into his mouth as a commentary on his greed, though this may be one of those historical details that sounds too perfect to be entirely true. The The defeat at Carrhae established the Parthians as the only power capable of standing up to Rome in sustained conflict. For the next 2.5 centuries, the Roman-Parthian wars would rage intermittently across Mesopotamia and Armenia, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Romans would occasionally capture Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, only to find that the Parthians simply moved their court to another city and continued fighting. Armenia became the particular bone of contention between the two empires, changing hands with the frequency of a disputed parking space. Both Rome and Parthia recognized that whoever controlled Armenia controlled the strategic routes between Asia and Europe, but neither could maintain permanent control over this mountainous kingdom. The eventual compromise, that Armenian kings should be Sassanids approved by Rome, satisfied no one and pleased everyone, which is generally the mark of a successful diplomatic solution. The Parthian Empire reached its zenith under Mithridates II, who ruled from about 123 to 88 before the Common Era. During his reign, Parthian control extended from eastern Turkey to Afghanistan, and Parthian diplomatic missions reached as far as China, establishing the connections that would make the Silk Road one of the ancient world's most important commercial arteries. The Parthians found themselves sitting astride the trade routes that connected east and west, collecting tolls and taxes from merchants carrying silk, spices, and precious stones between Rome and China. However, the very success of the Parthian Empire contained the seeds of its eventual downfall. The powerful noble families who served as the backbone of Parthian rule grew increasingly independent and ambitious, often opposing royal policies that conflicted with their local interests. The Arsacid family itself became divided by succession disputes, with different branches claiming the throne and calling upon various nobles for support. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, it was not uncommon to have 2 or more Parthian kings ruling simultaneously in different parts of the empire, each backed by different factions of the nobility. The end came not from Rome, despite centuries of conflict, but from within Iran itself. In the early 3rd century, a local ruler named Ardashir from the province of Fars, the same region that had produced Cyrus the Great over 7 centuries earlier, began challenging Parthian authority. Ardashir claimed descent from a legendary figure named Sassan, and styled himself as the rightful heir to the ancient Achaemenid kings. In 224, he defeated and killed the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in battle, and proclaimed himself Shah of Shahs, King of Kings. The new Sassanid Empire, named after Ardashir's ancestor Sassan, would prove to be everything the Parthians were not. Where the Parthians had been decentralized, the Sassanids created a highly centralized bureaucracy. Where the Parthians had been religiously tolerant, the Sassanids made Zoroastrianism the state religion and actively promoted its spread. Where the Parthians had been content to rule through existing local structures, the Sassanids imposed a unified system of administration throughout their territories. Ardashir and his successors consciously positioned themselves as the restorers of ancient Persian glory. They claimed direct descent from the Achaemenid kings, adopted Achaemenid royal titles and symbols, and promoted a revival of Persian culture and religion. The Sassanids built magnificent palaces decorated with rock reliefs showing their victories over Rome, established fire temples throughout the empire, and commissioned translations of Zoroastrian texts that had been scattered during the centuries of foreign rule. The most successful Sassanid ruler was Shapur I, who ruled from 241 to 272. Shapur had the remarkable distinction of capturing a Roman emperor in battle. Valerian was taken prisoner in 260 during a campaign in Mesopotamia, and he never let anyone forget it. Rock reliefs throughout the empire show Shapur receiving the submission of various Roman emperors, including the humiliating scene of Valerian kneeling before his Sassanid captor. These reliefs served as both art and propaganda, reminding subjects and enemies alike of Sassanid power and Roman humiliation. Under Shapur, the Sassanid Empire reached its greatest extent, controlling territory from the Caucasus Mountains to the Arabian Sea. Shapur was also a patron of learning, founding the Academy of Gundishapur, which became one of the ancient world's most important centers of scholarship, attracting scholars from across the known world and serving as a bridge between different intellectual traditions. The Sassanid promotion of Zoroastrianism transformed Iranian religious life. The Zoroastrian priesthood became a powerful political force. Fire temples were established in every major city, and the priests compiled the Avesta in its final form. Yet the Sassanid Empire faced the same fundamental challenges that had plagued every Iranian dynasty: hostile neighbours, internal rebellions, and the sheer difficulty of governing a vast, diverse territory. The final blow came not from the familiar enemies in the west and north, but from the south, where a new force was emerging from the Arabian Peninsula. The rise of Islam in the early 7th century created a dynamic new power that combined religious zeal with military effectiveness. The Arab armies that burst out of Arabia after the death of Muhammad in 632 were unlike anything the Sassanids had previously encountered. The timing could hardly have been worse for the Sassanid Empire. A long war with Byzantium had exhausted both empires, and the assassination of Khosrow II in 628 had triggered a succession crisis. When Yazdegerd III finally established himself as Shah in 632, he inherited an empire that was politically fragmented, militarily weakened, and financially bankrupt. The Arab conquest began almost immediately. Initial raids into Mesopotamia were followed by larger expeditions, and by 636, the Arabs had won a crushing victory at the Battle of Qadisiyah that opened the road to Ctesiphon. The Sassanid armies, despite their superior numbers and equipment, proved unable to cope with Arab mobility and tactics. The heavily armoured Sassanid cavalry that had dominated Middle Eastern battlefields for centuries found themselves outmanoeuvred by lightly armed Arab horsemen who could strike quickly and disappear before the Sassanids could respond. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Nahavand in 642, which Arab historians called the Conquest of Conquests. Here, the last major Sassanid army was destroyed, and with it died any hope of organised resistance to Arab rule. Yazdegerd fled from city to city, trying desperately to raise new forces, but the empire was crumbling around him. Local governors surrendered to the Arabs, noble families switched sides, and even Zoroastrian priests began to accommodate themselves to the new reality of Muslim rule. The end came in 651 when Yazdegerd was murdered by a miller near Merv, allegedly for his purse. The last Sassanid king died ignominiously, killed not by enemy soldiers but by a common criminal who may not even have known his victim's identity. With Yazdegerd's death, the Sassanid Empire ceased to exist, and Iran entered a new phase of its history as part of the expanding Islamic world. The Islamic conquest of Iran was remarkable not just for its speed but for its relative completeness. Unlike other conquered territories where local elites often maintained some independence under Arab rule, Iran was thoroughly integrated into the new Islamic state. Arabic became the language of administration and scholarship. Islamic law replaced Sassanid legal codes, and Islam gradually spread throughout Iranian society, though the process took several centuries to complete. Yet the conquest was also a beginning rather than an ending. Within a few generations, Persian-speaking Muslims would play crucial roles in Islamic civilization, serving as administrators, scholars, poets, and theologians. The synthesis of Persian and Islamic traditions would create a new form of Iranian identity that preserved elements of the ancient past while embracing the religious and cultural innovations of Islam. The Sassanid Empire was dead, but Iran was far from finished. Chapter 3: Medieval Dynasties and Mongol Invasions. The Islamic conquest of Iran had created something of a political vacuum in the eastern reaches of the Muslim world. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad ruled in theory over all the former Sassanid territories, but governing an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia was roughly as manageable as conducting a symphony orchestra via telegram. Into this vacuum stepped various ambitious dynasties, each claiming to rule in the name of the caliph while pursuing their own decidedly earthly interests. The Tahirids, Safavids, and most importantly the Sassanids, who ruled from Bukhara and truly demonstrated that Iranian political traditions had survived the Arab conquest intact. The Samanid Empire, which flourished from 819 to 999, was in many ways a dress rehearsal for the great medieval Iranian dynasties that would follow. Though nominally vassals of the Abbasid Caliph, the Samanids governed their territories much as the Sassanids had done, through efficient administration, cultural patronage, and judicious use of heavily armoured cavalry. They revived Persian literary culture, commissioned the great epic poem the Shahnameh from Ferdowsi, and established a model of Islamic Iranian kingship that would influence rulers for centuries to come. However, the Samanids had one weakness that would prove fatal: their reliance on Turkish slave soldiers, known as gulams. These warriors, purchased as children from the steppes and trained in military arts, were formidable fighters and utterly loyal to their masters. The only problem was that eventually they began to wonder why they should serve when they could rule, a question that has occurred to professional soldiers throughout history and rarely ends well for their employers. The end came when a Turkish slave commander named Sebuktigin established himself as governor of Ghazni in 977. Ghazni was a strategically located city in what is now Afghanistan, perfectly positioned to control the passes between the Iranian plateau and the Indian subcontinent. Sebuktigin proved to be an able administrator and military commander, gradually expanding his control over surrounding territories while maintaining the fiction of loyalty to his Samanid overlords. When Sebuktigin died in 997, he was succeeded by his son Mahmud, who possessed the two qualities most essential for medieval rulership: an insatiable appetite for conquest and an utter lack of false modesty about his achievements. Mahmud of Ghazni would spend the next 33 years systematically conquering everything within reach, transforming a minor principality into an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Indian Ocean. Mahmud was particularly fond of invading India, which he did 17 times with the enthusiasm of a shopper at a clearance sale. These campaigns were ostensibly motivated by religious zeal, but the vast quantities of gold that found their way back to Ghazni suggest that spiritual concerns may not have been his only consideration. His most famous raid was against the Temple of Somnath in Gujarat, where he allegedly broke the sacred lingam and carried away 20 million dinars in treasure. His raids transformed Ghazni into one of the wealthiest cities in the medieval world, and he used this wealth to patronize scholars and poets, making his court a rival to Baghdad itself. The great Persian poet Ferdowsi completed his epic Shahnameh at Mahmud's court, though the relationship between poet and patron was reportedly somewhat strained, possibly because Ferdowsi expected to be paid in gold rather than silver for his masterwork chronicling Iranian royal glory. The Ghaznavid Empire reached its zenith under Mahmud, but like many medieval states built around the personality and military genius of a single ruler, it began to decline almost immediately after his death in 1030. His successor, Masud, inherited all of his father's ambitions but unfortunately none of his military talent. This became painfully apparent in 1040 at the Battle of Dandankan, where a Ghaznavid army was comprehensively defeated by a new power emerging from the steppes, the Seljuk Turks. The Ghaznavid Empire reached its zenith under Mahmud, but like many medieval states built around the personality and military genius of a single ruler, it began to decline almost immediately after his death in 1030. His successor, Masud, inherited all of his father's ambitions but unfortunately none of his military talent. This became painfully apparent in 1040 at the Battle of Dandankan, where a Ghaznavid army was comprehensively defeated by a new power emerging from the steppes, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were originally Oghuz Turkish tribes who had converted to Islam and moved westward from Central Asia. Their victory at Dandankan effectively ended Ghaznavid control over Iran and established Seljuk dominance over most of the Middle East. The first great Seljuk ruler was Tughril Beg, who captured Baghdad in 1055 and was recognized by the Abbasid Caliph as Sultan. Tughril was succeeded by his nephew Alp Arslan, whose name literally meant heroic lion, and who lived up to the billing. His most famous victory came in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, where a Seljuk army defeated a massive Byzantine force and captured the Emperor Romanus Diogenes himself. This defeat convinced the Byzantines that they could no longer defend their eastern frontiers alone, leading eventually to their request for Western assistance that would result in the Crusades. Alp Arslan was succeeded by his son Malik Shah, under whom the Seljuk Empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Malik Shah ruled with the assistance of his brilliant Persian vizier Nizam al-Mulk, who effectively ran the day-to-day administration while the Sultan concentrated on military campaigns. Nizam al-Mulk established a network of madrasas throughout the empire and created administrative systems that would survive long after the Seljuk state itself had disappeared. The empire began to fragment almost immediately after Malik Shah's death in 1092, as the Seljuk custom of dividing territories among the ruler's sons inevitably led to civil wars. This internal strife weakened Seljuk control just as new challenges were emerging. The First Crusade arrived in Anatolia in 1097, taking advantage of Seljuk disunity to establish Crusader states in Syria and Palestine. Meanwhile, on the eastern frontiers, various Turkish tribes were pressing westward from Central Asia, seeking new territories and opportunities for plunder. Among these eastern threats, the most dangerous proved to be the Khwarezmians, who had established control over the vital oasis cities of Central Asia. The Khwarezm Shah Ala al-Din Muhammad had built a powerful empire by the early 13th century, but he had also made a crucial error in judgment. He had antagonized Genghis Khan by killing Mongol merchants and diplomats. This was roughly equivalent to poking a sleeping dragon with a very sharp stick and then expressing surprise when it woke up in a bad mood. This internal strife weakened Seljuk control over their territories just as new challenges were emerging. The First Crusade arrived in Anatolia in 1097, taking advantage of Seljuk disunity to establish Crusader states in Syria and Palestine. Meanwhile, on the eastern frontiers, various Turkish tribes were pressing westward from Central Asia, seeking new territories and opportunities for plunder. Among these eastern threats, the most dangerous proved to be the Khwarezmians, who had established control over the vital oasis cities of Central Asia. The Khwarezm Shah Ala al-Din Muhammad had built a powerful empire by the early 13th century, but he had also made a crucial error in judgment. He had antagonized Genghis Khan by killing Mongol merchants and diplomats. This was roughly equivalent to poking a sleeping dragon with a very sharp stick and then expressing surprise when it woke up in a bad mood. The Mongol invasion of Iran began in 1219, and it represented something unprecedented in the region's history. Previous conquests had involved the replacement of one ruling class by another, with most of the population and infrastructure remaining intact. The Mongols, however, approached warfare as a comprehensive system of terror designed to discourage resistance by making the consequences of opposition literally unthinkable. The scale of destruction was staggering. Cities like Nishapur, Merv and Herat, some of the largest urban centres in the world at the time, were systematically demolished and their entire population slaughtered. The Mongols destroyed irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for millennia, turning fertile regions into wastelands that would take centuries to recover. Contemporary historians describe the Mongol invasions as the end of the world, and from the perspective of many Iranian cities and towns, this assessment was not entirely hyperbolic. Genghis Khan himself died in 1227 before completing the conquest of Iran, but his successors continued the devastation. The final phase came under Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, who arrived in 1256 with explicit orders to destroy any remaining centres of resistance in the Islamic world. Hulagu was thorough in his approach, systematically eliminating the Ismaili strongholds in the Alborz Mountains before turning his attention to Baghdad. The siege and sack of Baghdad in 1258 marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled the Islamic world for over 500 years. Hulagu's forces killed the last Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, and reportedly built a pyramid from the skulls of the city's scholars and religious leaders. The destruction of Baghdad, which had been the centre of Islamic learning and culture for centuries, symbolized the broader transformation that the Mongol conquest had brought to the Middle East. Yet the Mongols proved to be surprisingly adaptable conquerors. Having destroyed the existing political and cultural structures of Iran, they gradually began to rebuild them, but according to their own specifications. Hulagu established the Ilkhanate, a Mongol state that would rule Iran for nearly a century. The Ilkhans, as they were known, initially maintained Mongol customs and religious practices, but they gradually adopted Persian administrative traditions and eventually converted to Islam. The conversion of the Mongols to Islam was a gradual process that reflected the practical necessities of governing a predominantly Muslim population. The first Ilkhan to convert was Ahmad Teguda in 1282, though his reign was brief and his conversion may have been more political than spiritual. The definitive Islamization of the Ilkhanate came under Ghazan Khan, who converted in 1295 and systematically promoted Islam throughout his domains. Ghazan's reign marked the beginning of a cultural renaissance in Iran. The Mongols, having destroyed much of the existing intellectual and artistic infrastructure, now set about rebuilding it with considerable investment and enthusiasm. They established new schools and libraries, patronized Persian poets and historians, and commissioned magnificent architectural projects that blended Mongol, Persian, and Islamic artistic traditions. The Ilkhanate also benefited from its position within the broader Mongol Empire, which facilitated trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Persian became the diplomatic language of much of Asia, and Iranian merchants and administrators found opportunities for advancement throughout the Mongol domains. However, the Ilkhanate faced the same fundamental challenges that had plagued previous Iranian dynasties: the difficulty of governing a vast and diverse territory with limited administrative resources. The end came in 1335 with the death of the last effective Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id. Without a clear successor, the empire fragmented into numerous small states, each claiming to represent the legitimate continuation of Mongol rule in Iran. This political fragmentation would continue for the next century and a half, creating the conditions for the rise of new powers that would once again attempt to unite the Iranian plateau under a single rule. The Mongol period in Iran represents one of history's great paradoxes, an era of unprecedented destruction that ultimately led to cultural and economic renewal. The Mongols eliminated the old political and social structures that had governed Iran for centuries, but in doing so they also created opportunities for innovation and adaptation that would shape Iranian civilization for generations to come. The trauma of the Mongol conquest became part of Iranian historical memory, but so too did the achievements of the Achaemenid period, when Persian culture once again flourished under foreign rule. Chapter 4: Safavid Glory to Qajar Decline. The collapse of the Ilkhanate in 1335 had left Iran fragmented into numerous small states, each claiming legitimacy while controlling little more than their own immediate neighbourhoods. This political chaos continued for nearly 2 centuries, interrupted only by the devastating campaigns of Timur, who swept through Iran like a particularly destructive tornado between 1383 and 1405, leaving behind a trail of ruined cities and architectural marvels in roughly equal measure. Into this fractured landscape came a most unlikely unifying force, a mystical Sufi order based in the obscure town of Ardabil in northwestern Iran. The Safavid order, founded by Sheikh Safi al-Din in the early 14th century, had gradually evolved from a peaceful religious brotherhood into something far more dangerous to the established order, a movement that combined spiritual fervour with military organisation. By the late 15th century, the Safavids had attracted a devoted following of Turkoman tribes known as the Qizilbash, or Red Heads, named after their distinctive 12-pointed red caps. The Qizilbash were warriors who had found in Safavid mysticism not just spiritual satisfaction, but also a cause worth fighting and dying for. They regarded their Safavid leaders as divinely inspired, if not actually divine, and they were willing to follow these leaders into battle with the sort of fanatical devotion that makes military historians nervous and enemy generals update their wills. When young Ismail Safavi emerged from hiding in Gilan in 1499, he commanded a force that was small in numbers but enormous in enthusiasm. Shah Ismail I was barely 13 years old when he began his conquest of Iran, which must have made him one of history's youngest world conquerors, though admittedly the competition for this particular title is fairly limited. What Ismail lacked in age and experience, he more than made up for in audacity and religious conviction. In 1501 he captured Tabriz and declared himself Shah of Iran, simultaneously announcing that Twelver Shia Islam would henceforth be the official religion of his realm. This religious proclamation was considerably more significant than it might appear to modern observers. Iran had been predominantly Sunni Muslim for centuries, and the decision to impose Shia Islam represented a complete transformation of the country's religious identity. Ismail didn't simply suggest that his subjects consider converting. He ordered all Sunni Muslims to become Shias, giving reluctant clerics the choice between conversion and exile. Those who refused both options faced execution, which proved to be a remarkably effective, if somewhat harsh, method of religious instruction. The establishment of Shia Islam as Iran's state religion created a religious divide that would define the region's politics for centuries to come. Iran became the champion of Shia Islam in a predominantly Sunni world, setting up conflicts with the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbek Khanates to the east. This religious distinctiveness gave Iran a unique identity that helped forge a sense of national unity, though it also ensured that the country would face nearly constant warfare with its Sunni neighbours. Ismail's military campaigns were initially remarkably successful, aided by superior tactics and the Qizilbash's willingness to charge enemy formations with what contemporary observers described as suicidal bravery. However, the harsh realities of 16th century warfare caught up with the Safavids at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where Ottoman forces armed with firearms and artillery decisively defeated Ismail's cavalry-based army. The young Shah, who had previously considered himself invincible and possibly divine, discovered that neither religious enthusiasm nor mystical authority could stop gunpowder weapons. The defeat at Chaldiran marked a turning point in Ismail's reign, and in Safavid military doctrine, the Shah fell into a depression that lasted for the rest of his life, reportedly turning to heavy drinking and leaving much of the actual governing to his Qizilbash commanders. This delegation of authority created its own problems, as the various Qizilbash tribes began fighting among themselves for control of the state, turning the Safavid court into something resembling an armed parliament, where disagreements were settled with swords rather than speeches. The chaos continued under Ismail's son Tahmasp I, who spent much of his long reign trying to balance the competing demands of his Qizilbash supporters while fending off Ottoman and Uzbek invasions. Tahmasp proved to be more cautious than his father, which was probably wise given the military realities of the time, but also meant that the Safavid Empire spent several decades in a defensive crouch, consolidating its control over Iran proper rather than expanding its territories. The Safavid Empire reached its zenith under Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629 and possessed the rare combination of political genius and military talent that marks truly great rulers. Abbas inherited an empire that was under attack from all directions and transformed it into one of the most powerful states in the world. His first major reform was military. He reduced the power of the unreliable Qizilbash tribes by creating a new army based on slave soldiers known as ghulams, primarily recruited from Christian populations in the Caucasus. These ghulam forces were trained in modern military techniques, including the use of firearms and artillery that the Safavids had been lacking since Chaldiran. More importantly, they were personally loyal to the Shah rather than to tribal leaders, giving Abbas a military force that he could rely upon in both foreign wars and domestic conflicts. This military modernization allowed Abbas to go on the offensive against the Ottomans, recapturing much of the territory that had been lost in previous decades. Abbas also moved the Safavid capital from Tabriz to Isfahan, transforming this central Iranian city into one of the most magnificent urban centers in the world. The Shah poured enormous resources into Isfahan's development, creating architectural marvels that still inspire visitors today. The great square known as Naqsh-e-Jahan, the Shah Mosque, and the Sheikh Lotfollah Mosque represented the height of Safavid artistic achievement, blending Persian, Islamic, and local architectural traditions into a distinctive style. Under Abbas's rule, Isfahan became known throughout the Islamic world for its beauty and sophistication. The saying, "Isfahan is half the world," reflected the city's reputation as a centre of trade, culture, and learning. European travellers who visited the Safavid court were impressed by the wealth and refinement they encountered, and some compared Isfahan favourably to the great cities of Europe. Abbas actively encouraged trade with European powers, seeing commercial relationships as a way to acquire both wealth and military technology. The Safavid Empire under Abbas controlled extensive trade networks that connected Europe with Central Asia and India. Persian silk became one of the most prized commodities in European markets, and the revenues from this trade funded both the military modernization and the architectural projects that made Abbas's reign so remarkable. The Shah also encouraged the development of carpet weaving and ceramics, crafts that would become synonymous with Persian culture. However, The very success of Abbas's reforms created new problems for his successors. The centralization of power in the hands of the Shah made the empire dependent on the personal abilities of its ruler, and most of Abbas's descendants proved to be considerably less capable than their ancestor. The practice of confining royal princes to the palace harem to prevent succession disputes, a policy adopted to ensure stability, had the unintended consequence of producing rulers who were completely unprepared for the realities of governing a major empire. The decline of the Safavids was gradual but steady throughout the 17th century. The empire faced renewed pressure from the Ottomans in the west and rising tribal confederations in the east, while internal corruption and court intrigue weakened central authority. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. Afghan tribes who had been loosely controlled by the Safavids began asserting their independence in the early 18th century. In 1722, an Afghan force led by Mahmud Hotaki captured Isfahan and brought the Safavid Empire to an ignominious end. The last effective Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, was captured and eventually executed, though various claimants continued to fight over the remnants of the empire for several more years. The Afghan occupation was brutal and destructive, devastating much of Iran and undoing many of the achievements of the Safavid period. The collapse of Safavid rule led to another period of fragmentation and chaos, as various local strongmen and tribal leaders carved out their own territories. This anarchic situation continued until the rise of Nader Shah Afshar, a military commander who reunited much of Iran under his rule in the 1730s and 1740s. Nader was a brilliant general who defeated the Afghans, recaptured much lost territory, and even launched successful campaigns into India, but his empire collapsed immediately after his assassination in 1747. After Nader Shah's death, Iran remained divided among several competing dynasties until the Qajar tribe emerged victorious in the late 18th century. Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar established himself as Shah in 1796, founding a dynasty that would rule Iran for nearly 130 years. The Qajar period began with the familiar challenge of reunifying a fragmented country, but it would face new difficulties that previous Iranian dynasties had never encountered. The Qajars came to power just as European colonial expansion was reaching its peak, and Iran found itself caught between the expanding Russian Empire to the north and British India to the southeast. Unlike previous foreign threats, which had generally involved military conquest followed by either assimilation or withdrawal, the European powers pursued a policy of gradual economic and political penetration that was harder to recognize and more difficult to resist. The early Qajar Shahs, particularly Fath Ali Shah, attempted to play the European powers against each other while modernizing their military forces. However, two disastrous wars with Russia in the early 19th century demonstrated that Iran could no longer compete militarily with European-trained armies equipped with modern weapons. The treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchay forced Iran to cede large territories in the Caucasus and granted Russia extensive commercial and legal privileges within Iranian territory. These defeats marked the beginning of what Iranian historians call the Century of Humiliation, as the country found itself increasingly subject to foreign interference while lacking the military or economic strength to resist effectively. The Qajars tried various strategies to modernize their country, including hiring European advisors and sending students to European universities, but their efforts were consistently undermined by internal corruption and external pressure. The most notorious example of Qajar weakness was the Tobacco Rebellion of 1891, triggered when Nasir al-Din Shah granted a British company a monopoly over Iran's tobacco production and trade. This concession, granted in exchange for a loan to finance the Shah's expensive European travels, provoked widespread protests that forced the government to cancel the agreement. The incident demonstrated both the extent of foreign economic penetration and the growing political consciousness of Iran's merchant and clerical classes. The accumulation of grievances against Qajar misrule finally exploded in the constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911, one of the first major democratic movements in the Middle East. The revolution began with protests against government corruption and foreign domination, but quickly evolved into a broader demand for constitutional monarchy and representative government. In 1906, Mozaffar al-Din Shah was forced to agree to the establishment of a parliament, or majlis, and the adoption of a constitution modelled on European examples. The constitutional revolution represented a remarkable achievement for Iran's emerging civil society, but it also revealed the depth of the country's problems. The new constitutional system was undermined by disagreements among the revolutionaries, resistance from conservative elements, and intervention by foreign powers who preferred dealing with a weak monarchy to a strong parliament. Russian troops helped suppress the constitutional movement in 1911, demonstrating that Iran's independence remained largely theoretical. The final collapse of Qajar rule came in the aftermath of World War I, which turned Iran into a battleground for competing foreign armies despite the country's declared neutrality. The war devastated Iran's economy and revealed the complete inability of the Qajar government to protect the country's sovereignty. In 1921, Reza Khan, a commander in the Persian Cossack Brigade, staged a coup that brought the Qajar period to an end and established the Pahlavi dynasty. The Safavid and Qajar periods together span nearly 4 centuries of Iranian history and encompass both the greatest achievements and the most painful defeats of the pre-modern era. The Safavids created a distinctly Iranian empire that successfully combined religious identity with political power, producing architectural and artistic achievements that remain among the treasures of world civilization. The Qajars, despite their ultimate failure, presided over Iran's first encounters with modernity and witnessed the emergence of the democratic and nationalist movements that would shape the country's future development. The transition from Safavid glory to Qajar decline illustrates the challenges faced by traditional empires in an age of rapid technological and political change. Chapter 5: Modern Iran, Pahlavist to Islamic Republic. The coup that brought Reza Khan to power in 1921 marked the beginning of what many historians consider Iran's tumultuous entry into the modern world. This was not the gentle modernization that some countries experienced gradually over decades, but rather the kind of rapid transformation that tends to leave entire populations feeling slightly dizzy, as if they had been riding a particularly energetic carousel while someone kept changing the music. Reza Khan, who crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925, possessed the sort of fierce determination that characterizes military leaders who have decided that their country needs to be dragged into the 20th century, whether it wants to go or not. Having risen from humble origins in the Persian Cossack Brigade, he had witnessed firsthand the weakness and chaos that had plagued Iran during the final decades of Qajar rule. His solution was comprehensive modernization implemented with military efficiency and a notable lack of patience for opposition. The new Shah's reforms were sweeping in scope and often shocking in their departure from traditional Iranian customs. He banned the wearing of veils, required Western-style dress, and insisted that all Iranians adopt surnames, a practice that had previously been limited to the aristocracy. The unveiling decree alone sparked riots in the holy city of Qom, as conservative religious leaders viewed these changes as attacks on Islamic values and Iranian identity. Reza Shah's response to such resistance was characteristically direct. Opposition was suppressed, and opponents often found themselves in prison or worse. Perhaps most importantly, Reza Shah launched an ambitious program of infrastructure development that transformed Iran's physical landscape. The construction of the Trans-Iranian Railway, connecting the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, was his proudest achievement. This engineering marvel required bridging impossible gorges and tunneling through seemingly impenetrable mountains, but it finally provided Iran with a modern transportation network that could support both military defense and economic development. The railway became a symbol of the new Iran that Reza Shah was determined to create. The educational reforms were equally dramatic. The Shah established Tehran University in 1935 and created a nationwide system of secular schools that challenged the traditional monopoly of religious education. Thousands of Iranian students were sent to European universities, creating a new class of Western-educated intellectuals who would play crucial roles in Iran's future development. However, this modernization came at considerable social and political cost, as democratic institutions were systematically undermined and opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. The Pahlavi modernization also coincided with the discovery and development of Iran's oil resources, which would fundamentally alter the country's relationship with the outside world. The oil industry, dominated by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, generated enormous revenues but provided Iran with only a modest share of the profits. This arrangement would become a source of growing resentment, as many Iranians came to believe that their natural resources were being exploited by foreign powers for the benefit of foreign stockholders. Reza Shah's downfall came during World War II, when his attempts to maintain neutrality while developing closer ties with Nazi Germany alarmed the Allied powers. In August 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, ostensibly to secure supply routes to the Soviet Union, but also to prevent German influence in this strategically vital region. Faced with military defeat and foreign occupation, Reza Shah abdicated in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and went into exile, where he died in 1944. The young Mohammad Reza Shah inherited a country under foreign occupation and a throne whose authority had been dramatically weakened by military defeat. Unlike his domineering father, the new Shah was initially cautious and somewhat insecure, struggling to establish his legitimacy while Allied forces remained on Iranian soil. The war years brought political openness that had been suppressed under Reza Shah, with new political parties emerging and the press regaining some freedom of expression. This period of relative liberalization came to an abrupt end with the oil nationalization crisis of 1951 to 1953, one of the most dramatic episodes in modern Iranian history. The crisis began when Mohammad Mossadegh, an elderly and charismatic politician, successfully campaigned for the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Mossadegh argued that Iran should control its own oil resources, rather than allowing a foreign corporation to extract the country's wealth while paying minimal royalties to the Iranian government. Mossadegh's National Front movement tapped into decades of accumulated resentment over foreign economic domination, and his appointment as Prime Minister in 1951 triggered a constitutional crisis that would reshape Iran's political development. The nationalization of the oil industry was overwhelmingly popular among Iranians, but it also created a confrontation with Britain that the weak Iranian state was ill-equipped to handle. The British imposed an economic blockade that prevented Iran from selling its oil on international markets, creating severe financial difficulties. The standoff between Mossadegh and the young Shah intensified as the economic crisis deepened. Mossadegh, who had developed a talent for dramatic political theatre, including receiving foreign diplomats while lying in bed claiming illness, gradually accumulated power at the expense of the monarchy. By 1953, Iran was in a state of virtual civil war, with competing crowds demonstrating for and against both the Prime Minister and the Shah in the streets of Tehran. The resolution came in the form of a CIA-orchestrated coup on August 19, 1953, which removed Mossadegh from power and restored the Shah's authority. Operation Ajax, as it was known to its American planners, was the first successful Cold War covert operation, and it demonstrated the new superpower's willingness to intervene directly in the domestic affairs of strategically important countries. The coup succeeded largely because Iranian society was deeply divided about Mossadegh's increasingly radical policies, and many conservative elements welcomed American intervention as a way to prevent what they feared was a slide toward communism. The aftermath of the coup fundamentally altered Iran's political trajectory. Mohammad Reza Shah, now backed by American support and convinced of his own divine mission, became increasingly autocratic. He dismantled the democratic institutions that had emerged during the oil crisis and created SAVAK, a secret police organization that became notorious for its surveillance and repression of political opponents. The coup also ensured that Iran's oil industry would be controlled by an international consortium in which American companies held a 40% share, effectively ending British dominance over Iranian petroleum. With the oil crisis resolved and his authority secured, Mohammad Reza Shah launched his own modernization program, the White Revolution, beginning in 1963. This ambitious initiative included land reform, women's suffrage, literacy campaigns, and rapid industrialization. The program produced remarkable economic growth, with Iran's gross national product multiplying several hundred times during the Pahlavi period. However, the rapid social changes also generated serious tensions, as land reform disrupted traditional agricultural systems and many rural families migrated to cities where they lived in poverty. The Shah's increasing megalomania became evident in 1971, when he staged an extravagant celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the Persian monarchy. The festivities, held at the ruins of Persepolis, cost an estimated $100 million and featured elaborate ceremonies designed to link the Pahlavi dynasty with the ancient Achaemenid Empire. Foreign dignitaries were served by waiters from Paris, while many ordinary Iranians struggled with inflation and political repression. The celebration became a symbol of the regime's disconnect from popular concerns and its obsession with grandiose projects rather than practical governance. By the mid-1970s, opposition to the Shah's rule was growing across Iranian society, though it remained fragmented and largely underground due to SAVAK surveillance. Secular intellectuals criticized the regime's authoritarianism and dependence on American support, while leftist groups advocated revolutionary change inspired by other Third World liberation movements. Most significantly, Islamic clergy under the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini began articulating a religious critique of the Pahlavi regime that resonated with both traditional believers and those who had been alienated by rapid modernization. Khomeini, who had been exiled in 1964 for opposing the White Revolution, developed from his base in Iraq a comprehensive ideology that rejected both Western capitalism and Soviet socialism in favor of an Islamic republic governed according to religious principles. His messages, smuggled into Iran on audio cassettes, offered a powerful alternative vision that appealed to diverse groups who shared little except their opposition to the Shah. The Ayatollah's political theory combined traditional Shia religious authority with modern revolutionary rhetoric, creating something genuinely new in the history of political movements. The revolution that erupted in 1978 began with relatively modest protests by religious students in Qom, but quickly spread throughout Iranian society as different groups joined what became a massive popular uprising. The Shah's increasingly desperate attempts to contain the revolution through a combination of concessions and repression only served to encourage further demonstrations. By late 1978, general strikes had paralyzed the economy, and millions of Iranians were participating in protests that demanded the Shah's immediate departure. What made the Iranian Revolution unique was its extraordinary breadth of popular participation and its surprisingly non-violent character. Workers, students, merchants, clergy, and middle-class professionals all joined demonstrations that were organized through mosque networks rather than political parties. The revolution's leadership consistently emphasized peaceful resistance, urging crowds to win over rather than fight the military forces that the Shah deployed against them. Thousands of soldiers eventually defected to the revolutionary side, leaving the regime without reliable means of maintaining order. The Shah's final collapse was remarkably swift. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran for what was ostensibly a short medical trip, but became permanent exile. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from his own 14-year exile to a rapturous welcome from millions of Iranians who lined the streets of Tehran. The revolution was effectively complete by February 11th, when the military declared its neutrality and the last remnants of the imperial government surrendered power to Khomeini's revolutionary committees. The establishment of the Islamic Republic represented one of the most dramatic political transformations of the 20th century. Khomeini and his clerical allies moved quickly to consolidate power, sidelining secular and leftist groups that had participated in the revolution but lacked the organizational capacity of the religious establishment. A new constitution, approved by referendum in December 1979, created a unique system of government that combined democratic and theocratic elements under the ultimate authority of a supreme leader who was answerable only to God. The revolution's early years were marked by intense internal conflict, as various factions struggled for control of the new state. The seizure of the American embassy in November 1979 by militant students created a 444-day hostage crisis that severed diplomatic relations with the United States and established Iran as a leader of anti-Western sentiment in the Islamic world. Meanwhile, the new regime faced armed opposition from various groups, including monarchist loyalists, communist organizations, and ethnic minorities seeking greater autonomy. The situation was further complicated by Iraq's invasion in September 1980, which began an 8-year war that would cost over 1 million lives and devastate both countries' economies. Paradoxically, the war helped the Islamic Republic survive its tumultuous early period by rallying nationalist sentiment and providing justification for the suppression of domestic opposition. The conflict also demonstrated the revolutionary regime's determination to resist foreign pressure, even at enormous human and economic cost. By the time of Khomeini's death in 1989, the Islamic Republic had survived its revolutionary birth pangs and established itself as a permanent feature of Middle Eastern politics. The system that emerged was neither the democratic republic that secular revolutionaries had envisioned, nor the traditional monarchy that conservatives might have preferred, but rather something entirely new, a clerical state that claimed legitimacy through both popular sovereignty and divine authority. The transformation from Pahlavi monarchy to Islamic Republic represents more than just a change of government. It reflects the complex relationship between tradition and modernity that has characterized Iran's experience throughout the modern period. The Pahlavis attempted to modernize Iran by adopting Western models and marginalizing traditional institutions While the Islamic Revolution sought to combine elements of modernity with indigenous religious and cultural traditions, both experiments have had profound consequences not only for Iran but for the broader Middle East and the international system. The Iranian experience during the 20th century illustrates the challenges faced by societies attempting to navigate rapid modernization while preserving their cultural identity. The Pahlavi period demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of top-down reform, while the Islamic Revolution showed how traditional institutions could adapt to modern conditions and provide alternative models of political organization. The continuing evolution of the Islamic Republic suggests that this process of adaptation and change remains ongoing, with implications that extend far beyond Iran's borders. Chapter 6: Contemporary Geography and Culture. To understand modern Iran, one must first appreciate the extraordinary geographical stage upon which this ancient civilization continues to unfold its story. This is a country that encompasses 11 of the world's 13 climate types within its borders, creating a landscape so diverse that it defies the simple desert stereotypes often associated with the Middle East. From snow-capped peaks that rival the Alps to subtropical forests that could belong in Southeast Asia, Iran's geography reads like nature's own encyclopedia. The country stretches across 1,600,000 square kilometers, making it roughly 3 times the size of France and slightly larger than Alaska. But these numbers fail to capture the dramatic topographical theatre that defines Iranian life. Massive mountain ranges wrap around the country like protective arms, creating a high central plateau that sits an average of 900 meters above sea level. This elevated heartland is where most Iranians have made their homes for thousands of years, adapting to an environment that demands both resilience and ingenuity. The Zagros Mountains, Iran's most prominent geographical feature, sweep across the western and southwestern regions in a series of parallel ridges that march from the Armenian highlands all the way to the Strait of Hormuz. Many peaks in this range exceed 3,000 meters in elevation, creating a natural barrier that has shaped trade routes, military campaigns, and cultural development for millennia. These are not the gentle, rolling hills of pastoral poetry, but rather formidable limestone fortresses that have made east-west travel historically challenging and given rise to distinct regional cultures separated by dramatic gorges and high passes. To the north, the Alborz Mountains follow the southern shore of the Caspian Sea like a narrow but imposing crown. Here stands Mount Damavand, Iran's highest peak at 5,600 meters, a volcanic giant whose snow-covered summit can be seen from Tehran on clear days. The sight of this majestic mountain rising from the smog of the capital serves as a daily reminder to millions of urban Iranians that their country's natural grandeur persists even amid the challenges of modern development. Between these mountain ranges lies the Central Plateau, a vast elevated basin that contains some of the most forbidding yet strangely beautiful landscapes on Earth. The eastern portion hosts 2 great salt deserts, the Dasht-e Kavir, known as the Great Salt Desert, and the Dasht-e Lut, which translates rather ominously as the Desert of Emptiness. These are places where temperatures can soar to among the highest ever recorded on the planet's surface, where salt flats stretch to horizons that shimmer like mirages, and where the silence is so profound that visitors often report hearing the sound of their own heartbeat. Yet even these apparently lifeless expanses support hardy desert animals and scattered oases where traditional communities developed sophisticated water management systems. The famous qanats, underground channels bringing water from mountain aquifers to plateau settlements, represent one of humanity's most ingenious solutions to arid environments. These subterranean engineering marvels have operated continuously for over 2,000 years. Iran's climate diversity extends to its coastal regions. Along the Caspian Sea, a narrow strip supports lush forests and receives over 1,500 millimeters of annual precipitation, creating an environment dramatically different from the central deserts. The southern Persian Gulf coast presents another extreme, where cities like Ahvaz experience summer temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, requiring traditional architecture with elaborate wind towers and cooling systems. This extraordinary physical diversity has profoundly shaped how Iranians live, work, and see themselves. The mountain barriers that ring the central plateau have historically made transportation difficult, fostering the development of distinct regional cultures while simultaneously creating a shared Iranian identity based on adaptation to challenging environments. Traditional Persian poetry often celebrates this geographical diversity, with verses that move seamlessly from descriptions of snow-covered peaks to desert mirages to garden oases, reflecting a cultural consciousness deeply attuned to the country's natural variety. Modern Iran's urban centres reflect this geographical influence in their distinct characters and development patterns. Tehran, sprawling across the southern slopes of the Alborz Mountains, houses over 8 million people who daily navigate the challenges of altitude, air quality, and dramatic seasonal temperature variations. The capital's location at 1,200 meters above sea level means that winter brings snow and sharp cold, while summer heat is tempered by the elevation and proximity to mountain breezes that provide relief from the central plateau's more extreme conditions. Isfahan, the jewel of the central plateau, demonstrates how Persian civilization learned to create beauty in the midst of aridity. The city's famous gardens, bridges, and mosques were designed to maximize the use of precious water resources while creating environments of remarkable aesthetic sophistication. The Zayandeh River, which flows through the heart of the city, has been carefully managed for centuries through a complex system of dams, channels, and traditional distribution methods that ensure both urban needs and agricultural requirements are met. Shiraz, nestled in a fertile valley among the Zagros foothills, enjoys a more moderate climate that has made it the traditional centre of Persian poetry and garden culture. The city's location provides access to the diverse ecosystems of both mountain and plateau, creating the kind of environmental richness that inspired classical Persian poets to develop their elaborate metaphorical systems linking natural beauty with human emotion. When Hafez wrote of nightingales and roses, he was drawing on a living landscape that his readers could experience in their daily lives. The cultural implications of this geographical diversity extend far beyond poetry and architecture. Iran's position at the intersection of Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and South Asian trade routes made it a natural crossroads for the exchange of ideas, goods, and technologies. The Silk Road passes that wound through Iranian territory carried more than just merchants and caravans. They transported the cultural influences that would help create Persian civilization's distinctive synthetic character. Contemporary Iranian culture continues to reflect this historical role as a cultural bridge between different worlds. The Persian language serves as a literary medium across a vast region stretching from Turkey to India, while Iranian artistic traditions influenced everything from Mughal miniature painting to Central Asian carpet weaving. This cultural reach, rooted in geography and reinforced by historical trade patterns, helps explain why Iranian civilization has maintained its distinctive identity despite centuries of political upheaval and foreign influence. Traditional Iranian festivals demonstrate this deep connection between culture and geography. Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebrated at the spring equinox, embodies a sophisticated understanding of natural cycles that reflects Iran's agricultural heritage. The 13-day celebration includes the Haftseen table with symbolic seasonal items and outdoor picnics that reconnect urban families with the landscape. The fire-jumping ceremony of Chaharshanbe Suri originally served practical purposes but evolved into symbolic purification, demonstrating how Iranian culture developed elaborate systems connecting communities to natural rhythms. Iranian poetry draws extensively on geographical vocabulary, with classical poets like Rumi and Hafez creating complex metaphorical systems using Iran's diverse landscapes as symbols for spiritual states. The Persian carpet tradition similarly reflects geographical diversity, with different regions developing distinct styles incorporating local materials and design motifs. Contemporary Iranian cuisine continues this pattern, with rice dishes predominating in the water-rich Caspian region, while mountainous areas favour heartier stews suitable for long winters. The Persian garden tradition, which UNESCO has recognised as a masterpiece of cultural heritage, represents perhaps the most sophisticated response to Iran's geographical challenges. These gardens, found throughout the historic Persian cultural sphere, were designed as earthly paradises that demonstrated humanity's ability to create beauty and abundance even in harsh environments. The classical four-part design, with its central water channels and carefully planned plant selections, serves both aesthetic and practical purposes, creating microclimates that provide relief from heat while demonstrating mastery over water resources. Modern Iranian architecture continues to grapple with the same environmental challenges that shaped traditional building practices. Contemporary architects working in Iran must design for extreme temperature variations, water scarcity, seismic activity, and air quality issues, while respecting cultural traditions and religious requirements. The results often demonstrate remarkable innovation, as designers adapt traditional techniques like wind towers and courtyards to modern materials and urban conditions. Iran's remarkable biodiversity reflects its position at the intersection of several major ecological zones. The country serves as a bridge between the Euro-Siberian forests of the north, the arid steppes of Central Asia, and the subtropical regions of the south. This ecological diversity supports over 8,000 plant species, 500 bird species, and nearly 300 mammal species, making Iran one of the most biologically diverse countries in the Middle East. The wetlands of the Caspian region and Persian Gulf serve as crucial stopping points for migratory birds travelling between Africa and the Indian subcontinent. These areas support not only countless waterfowl, but also provide habitat for species as diverse as the endangered Caspian seal and the flamingos that gather in the salt lakes of the Central Plateau. The contrast between these thriving ecosystems and the nearby desert regions demonstrates nature's ability to create abundance even in seemingly impossible conditions. Unfortunately, Iran's environment faces significant contemporary challenges. Climate change, water mismanagement, and urbanization have created severe environmental crises. Lake Urmia has shrunk by over 80%, creating dust storms affecting regional air quality. The ancient Qanat system faces threats from modern drilling that disrupts underground water flows, forcing rural migration to cities while abandoning traditional agricultural areas. Despite these challenges, Iranian society demonstrates remarkable resilience rooted in centuries of resource management experience. Contemporary engineers develop innovative approaches to water conservation and renewable energy that combine traditional knowledge with modern technology. The young Iranian population increasingly sees environmental protection as both practical necessity and cultural obligation, making environmental issues central to discussions about the country's future. Iran's position at the crossroads of three continents continues to shape its contemporary role in global affairs, just as geography influenced its historical development. The country controls crucial shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, sits atop some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, and serves as a bridge between the Middle East and Central Asia. These geographical advantages provide both opportunities and responsibilities that influence how Iran interacts with its neighbours and the broader international community. The cultural implications of Iran's geographical position remain equally significant in the contemporary world. Persian language and literature continue to influence intellectual life across a vast region, while Iranian cinema, music, and visual arts draw on the country's cultural heritage to create works that speak to universal human experiences. The success of Iranian films at international festivals demonstrates how artistic traditions, rooted in specific geographical and cultural contexts, can transcend national boundaries to find global audiences. As Iran moves forward into an uncertain future, its extraordinary geographical heritage provides both challenges and opportunities. The same environmental extremes that forced previous generations to develop remarkable adaptations to difficult conditions now require contemporary Iranians to find new solutions to problems like water scarcity, air pollution, and urban overcrowding. The cultural traditions that emerge from this geographical context, the emphasis on poetry and beauty, the sophisticated approach to garden design, the complex systems for managing scarce resources, may provide inspiration for addressing contemporary challenges. Understanding Iran means appreciating how geography and culture have shaped each other across thousands of years of human habitation, from the snow-capped peaks of the Alborz to the salt flats of the central deserts, from the lush forests of the Caspian coast to the date palms of the Persian Gulf. This is a country where natural extremes have fostered human creativity and resilience. The result is a civilization that combines ancient wisdom with contemporary innovation, traditional beauty with modern necessity, creating a cultural landscape as diverse and compelling as the physical geography that cradles it. Iran's story, told through its geography and culture, reminds us that human societies are never separate from the natural environments that sustain them. In this ancient land where civilizations have risen and fallen, where conquerors have come and gone, the enduring relationship between people and place continues to shape both individual lives and collective identity. As global challenges like climate change and resource depletion test the resilience of societies worldwide, Iran's long experience of adaptation to environmental extremes may offer lessons for building more sustainable and culturally rich ways of living on our shared planet.